So here I am with my man Mario, who is a disciple of Thomas Sowell and Booker T. Washington. So he and I have that in common. We're here at the famous Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. So Mario, tell us a little bit about Dunbar.
The school standing behind us has a long, illustrious history that is very much untouched, unfortunately. Dunbar High School was the first all-black public high school in the D.C. area and was founded in 1872. The first black man to graduate from Harvard, Mr. Richard Greener, was a principal here, as well as the first black woman to earn a degree in an American university, Miss Mary Jane Patterson. During its initial 80-year history prior to the infamous Brown decision in 1954, Dunbar's rate of matriculation was significantly high, as well as facilitating many of the first black who's who. The first black federal judge, the first black full professor at a major American university, Dr. Charles Drew, the breakthrough in blood plasma, the first black military general, Mr. Benjamin O. Davis. Langston Hughes was a graduate as well. You go down the line, the rate of matriculation, the reputation of this institution was so prestigious that there was a point in history where students from the school did not have to take an entry-level examination to get into Ivy League universities. Amongst that, one thing, there's a lot of misnomers or many things about the many solutions promulgated by the education establishment today, which Dunbar heavily repudiated. One being that the black children from the school came from affluent background or high degree of white ancestry, which both of them turned out to be false. Dunbar, in its infancy, of course, just like most schools, prior to the Brown decision, didn't have an exorbitant amount of resources at hand. Dunbar didn't have a cafeteria until roughly 40 years into its existence, and even then wasn't enough to accommodate all the students. Dunbar didn't have a PA system until roughly the 1950s. Yet it still had a matriculation rate in the depths of the Great Depression higher than in the subsequent years in the 1990s in the post-civil rights era, after an exorbitant amount of resources and endless good intentions was promised by major legislation, i.e. the Brown decision and the numerous civil rights acts thereafter, as well as the establishment of the Department of Education. Successes like Dunbar are key and tantamount as to looking at upward mobility. The fact that such a school exists today, and even in the Smithsonian in Washington D.C., the Black History Museum, such a landmark there's an aversion to Dunbar High School, and it's such a travesty. Here you can look at to a success and see how it was facilitated. As Dr. Sowell said, more than half of many of the black who's who came here, and that's factoring in some of the other reputable black schools like Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta, like Frederick Douglass High School in Maryland, or St. Pius X High School, which Clarence Thomas graduated from in Savannah, Georgia, and the like.
So Mario,
Yes.
you're familiar with what happened in Detroit with the school that was renamed for Dr. Ben Carson, and you have a member of the Detroit public school system, Detroit school board, who wants to take Ben Carson's name off of the school. Are you familiar with that story?
I've heard about it. There's been a whole slew of kind of proselytizing going on. I've also, in tandem with that, I don't know if you heard, and gladly it was defeated, in Clarence Thomas's hometown in Savannah, Georgia, there was an institution that had a building named after him on campus, which a few students, petitioned to have it removed due to the frivolous allegations that were largely unfounded during his confirmation hearing from Miss Anita Hill.
So what was interesting to me, you talked about the matriculation rate at these schools, and here it was, you're talking about, basically 50 to 100 years post-slavery, definitely before the civil rights movement. But and as Thomas Sowell said, listen, we can sit there and try to place blame on slavery for things, but we can look at what the graduation rate was, we can look at what the marriage rate was in the 50 years post-slavery, and then we can compare 50 years post the civil rights movement, and we can say that there's no way that you can attribute all the failures, current failures in the black community on slavery. They have to be attributed towards the civil rights movement, or more importantly, the growth of cultural Marxism. But one of the things I would point out is with the Detroit public schools, Here it is, you have Ben Carson's school, the school that was renamed after Ben Carson, and they want to take his name off. The school was supposed to be there to help push students towards math and science, but they have a 92% graduation rate, right? But that's admirable to have a 92% graduation rate. The problem is that when it comes to passing the state's competency level, the reading comprehension level among their graduates is only 26%, and the math comprehension level is only 17%. So I always ask the question, how is it you're graduating 92% of your students, but only 26% of them can pass the reading comprehension, and only 17% can pass the math comprehension? And those levels are set based off of really 8th grade math and 8th grade reading. It's not actually based off of 12th grade. And so here it is. Let's talk about, here it is, Dunbar High School or Stuyvesant High School, which is where Thomas Sowell. Let's talk about the standards that they had.
Well, interestingly enough, I'm glad you said that. Of course, nuance analysis is something seldom had in much contemporary discourse, and you're absolutely right. What you would find interesting, if you can look at throughout history, you'd have to ask yourself, how was many of the first black who's who facilitated prior to the landmark decisions, the Brown decision, as well as the 1964-1968 Civil Rights Act? Clearly, I mean, discrimination can't explain every phenomenon nor any bisectitude. I mean, I don't think you would make an argument that there was less discrimination during Dunbar's heyday than in the post-civil rights era. One of the things that Dunbar was able to do is, as Dr. Sowell in his remarkable journal detailed and chronicled, is that with all the remarkable black schools, irrespective of the racial, religious, or ethnic composition of the faculty, irrespective of the income of the parents or the resources that the school had, there was a such thing as standards that were largely able to be sustained. In the post-civil rights era, with more and more money being pumped into education, what happened was more bureaucratic control, ultimately leading to distant bureaucrats receiving a high amount of the resources, as well as having more demonstrable control than the parents themselves, in tandem with third-party organizations like teachers' unions, for example. Dunbar was able to enforce standards, dress code standards, how you conduct yourself off of campus as well. If that were to be implemented today, that would be under the harsh scrutiny of civil rights organizations, and it would be costly and frivolous lawsuits that most schools and institutions don't want to deal with. So they'll acquiesce to low standards in order not to deal with judicial scrutiny.
And one of the things I've talked about, Mario, is people have an amazing habit, an amazing propensity to either soar up to hit whatever standards you set, or to swoop down to hit whatever standards you set. And that is one of the problems. And this, and you and I both know as acolytes of that dude, Booker T. Washington, that one of his first book was on character building, and that he understood the absolute cruciality, the importance of building your character first. And one of the things that he talked about was that we tried to go from being slaves. That's why his book was written, was called Up From Slavery, that we could not go from being slaves one day to running, in the 100-meter dash the next day. Essentially, you have to learn how to crawl, and then you have to learn how to waddle like a toddler, and then learn how to walk before you can run. And that was a mistake that we made. And he said, we have to take a step back. And people thought that he was trying to keep black folks down and trying to keep us out in the fields. When he said that, he was like, no, I want you to know how to run, but you got to learn how to walk, and which means you have to learn how to crawl first. And that is one of the reasons, that mindset is what allowed us to advance so quickly. And when people look at, I think Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams both have talked about this, the reading level, right? I mean, you basically went in 1860, there were roughly 4.4 million blacks in America. And essentially, people don't understand, there's roughly 10% of them were free blacks. About 400,000 blacks were free in 1860. That's something they don't teach in public schools. I can almost guarantee you that even here at Dunbar, they're not teaching these students that in 1860, roughly 10% of the blacks in America were free. But there was land ownership, but I bet they're not also teaching the fact, and Booker T talked about in his book, the Negro in Business, he talked about the fact that by 1910 or 1915, or roughly 1910, black folks owned roughly 20 million acres of land. Because one of the things he said is, I want to see you own land, right? And he understood that character building, developing strong traditional nuclear families, and then then having that and allowing yourself to build up your own community, building up businesses and all that. And he said it's like there's nothing wrong with having lawyers, but you need an infrastructure to support lawyers. And here we have today, we have this edifice, and I mean, this is a beautiful building, right? Look at Paul Dunbar High School. It's a beautiful building here in Northwest Washington, D.C. It's an edifice to education. But as you were saying, Mario, what is the quality of education that students are getting here at Dunbar today versus 50 years ago?
You know, there was an old myth, an old saying that if you wanted to invoke a sense of strife with a Washington resident, you would talk about the different eras of Dunbar. And it was once a school that had a pristine reputation. And in the later generations, it just became another ghetto school. Now, interesting enough, as we talked about the remarkable accolades of Dunbar, what's interesting is its downfall. The downfall from Dunbar wasn't the Klan, it wasn't some hidden racist, it was good intentions, i.e. the mantra of forced diversity, basically eroding the standards that were set in place there for this age of diversity. Therefore, inculcating an environment where disciplining children became hard, as well as the evisceration of placement tests, which were administered there, which were seen as a barrier. Parents from even distant zip codes would strive for their children to get into this school. With the evisceration of standards, basically decency became optional. And as I previously mentioned, the aforementioned frivolous lawsuits of disciplining children, then the ACLU going into inner cities, making the educational process, as opposed to, prior when you didn't have these vicissitudes in the way.
So do you have any idea what the demographics are currently of Dunbar? Is it predominantly black?
Yes, it's 98% black. The other 2%, of course, is a mixed composition, a small percent of Asian, Hispanic, and white children. But yes, now it's a 98% school, and just like most other public schools, the percentage of black children American education as a whole is nothing to write home about, but if you compare that, blacks and whites, as of currently, the average black 12th grader, they're on par in mathematics and reading, on par with the average white 8th grader in mathematics and writing.
So I just saw something, and at the end of the day, I've talked about this in other videos, is that in America, we can ultimately judge things numbers, right? Numbers matter, right? I mean, the three questions that Thomas Sowell always asked that basically debunk everything that leftists say. Number one, he asks is that at what cost, right? The second question is compared to what, and the third is where's your hard data? So I was just looking at some stats from the Census Bureau, and it was breaking things down by different ethnic groups in America based on median household income. And I just talked about this in a Facebook Live video I did the other night, and it was saying that if racism, you can look at the numbers because you have to ask these questions. If there's supposed to be the evil white man who's out to keep everybody down who's not white, then that would show up economically, right? So you would say, here's the interesting thing. East Asian Indians have the highest median household income of any ethnic group in America. Their median household income, I believe, is $112,000 a year. And of course, and just not to insult the intelligence of any listeners, but what's the definition of median? Median means half are above and half are below. So half of all East Asian Indians have household incomes above $112,000 and half have below. The median household income for the United States of America as a whole is roughly $59,000. The median household income for whites in America is roughly $69,000. Here's the problem. The median household income for blacks or African Americans, for argument's sake, is roughly $30,000. So here it is. You have, once again, look at this glorious edifice to education in Northwest Washington, D.C. You can see a little bit of it right there. You see, that's the Capitol Dome over there. This is where we are in Northwest Washington, D.C. This is an area that's been recently gentrified, to use that term. But why is it that now with more access to resources than ever before, right? Supposedly, why is it that blacks are falling farther behind? What's your take on why we're falling farther behind economically, Mario?
As we look at human affairs across the world, across different time frames in different countries, with the melting pot of the United States, it's not an exception. There are numerous variables to go into why certain groups succeed or fail or may achieve certain marks, etc. There are innumerable factors. Of course, with blacks, usually when discussing race commentary, blacks are usually viewed as a homogenous entity, not ever allowing for diversity of different classes of blacks. And even within blacks, you have black immigrants who, on average, fall into the same category of higher median incomes, as well as higher rates of entrepreneurial skills. Look at the phenomenal successes of black West Indians, who were not just in income and occupation, but also reputation.
Give me an idea. What nations are you talking about when you're saying
Jamaica,
West Indians?
Haiti, Trinidad, Bahamas. The first black Oscar-winning actor, Sidney Poitier, was of West Indian ancestry. Of course, needless to say, Marcus Garvey, Shirley Chisholm, some of even the militant leaders, Stokely Carmichael, James Weldon Johnson, Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan.
So now, okay, here's an interesting thing. The stats are, at least Skip Gates, right? Skip Gates is a historian, the one who was infamous Beergate with President Obama. Even his documentation has shown that of the roughly somewhere between 10 to 12 million African slaves that we accurately say that they were sold into slavery by their fellow Africans and then brought to the West, right? Approximately 10 to 12 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage. But I don't know. I mean, I'll just ask you first. Are you aware of the numbers of approximately how many ended up here in what became the United States?
I don't know. I don't have these solid figures, not off the top of my head. No, not at this moment.
So, well, let me, because I've been studying this a little bit closely. So, did you know that approximately of those somewhere between 10 to 12 million African slaves that were transported to the West, about 5 million of them alone ended up in Brazil.
Wow.
So, rough numbers, you're talking about between South America and Central America, roughly 80% of African slaves ended up in South America and Central America. So we're talking about Brazil, Venezuela, is it Suriname? I can't remember off the top of my head. But then, of course, Central American nations. Like my wife's family is from from Panama and Costa Rica and places like that. And then, of course, about another 15% of them ended up in the Caribbean, right? Jamaica. You have the island of Hispaniola. And then only about 400,000 were imported into the 13 colonies that obviously became the United States of America. So people like to think of blacks as being homogenous, but we're not. Every black person that you see walking around is not a descendant of the slaves who were brought to the United States of America. There's large percentages who are immigrants. And one of the things that you just pointed out is the education level and then the eventual socioeconomic success of black immigrants. Why do you think it tends to be higher than those who are born and raised in the United States of America?
What chroniclers of history have come to the conclusion that it's ultimately culture that plays a big factor. Throughout early developmental years, or you had numerous anthropologists like Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, etc. There were all types of ridiculous theories. Of course, the infamous Charles Murray and Richard Horstein's bell curve, Dr. Arthur Jensen's study on race and IQ, and there's so much conflicting evidence. What's unique about black immigrants is that just like ordinary blacks, they in many cases reside in the same neighborhoods, children attend the same schools, but yet their performances on standardized testing or entrepreneurship or income are night and day. And that's not just for black immigrants, that's other immigrant groups. Asian immigrants, as they migrate here, especially Chinese, do better than Chinese that were born here, as the same with white immigrants, so on and so forth. So it's difficult to come to the conclusion that if you don't believe that it's some structural nefarious entity that can dictate millions of transactions between thousands of people, the notion that that this is all of one entity or even genetic is ridiculous. Dunbar is a classic example. Dunbar's IQ in standardized testing far exceeded the median average of the time. Are we to believe that the children of these schools came from a different genetic cloth as other blacks from other areas of lesser schools? That's highly unlikely. So yes, as you go through these things, there's just innumerable anomalies or disparities that just do not, that go either way, which do not make sense with certain particular ideologies or rhetoric.
So there's easy predictors when you dive into the numbers as economists like Thomas Sowell. I mean, Booker T. Washington was not an economist, but he studied economics. He was not a sociologist, but he studied sociology. He was not a historian, but he studied history. And so the same for Thomas Sowell. When you start studying these things, is it become pretty obvious now, the predictors for success in America?
Absolutely. That is, yeah, absolutely. I think another thing too, it's with a lot of discourse, is that there's a kind of caveat off the infamous Booker T. Washington quote. There's a class of colored who doesn't want the Negro to lose his grievances, knowing they've made a job. As we looked at discourse, there are real factors, external factors like poor schooling, but unfortunately do not get touched by particular ilks, because touching on these successes renders them obsolete. A lot of the black successes that were typically neglected prior to the infamous landmark decisions, like the proliferation of the black middle class, like the massive declination out of poverty prior to the 1950s, when there was far more stringent racism, is something that is seldom highlighted. To have a Dunbar high school would be a stern repudiation of the education establishment today. Along with many of the other charter schools that are in existence right now, which seldom their successes are not highlighted as often.
So let's bring this home here, Mario. Once again, we're standing in front of Dunbar High School in Northwest Washington, D.C. If you had the power to do exactly as you'd want to do, what would you do differently with this school right now?
Well, I would not the school itself. The schools are entities. It's mainly government. Mm-hmm. It's government through its bureaucracies, through its monopoly on force, that has a hegemony on education. And if you're fixated with psychologizing and finding racism and not analyzing actual policy that gets results, then you're just foredoomed to failure.
So basically, if we could remove the power of, here it is, the Department of Education, currently run by Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, in which the rumor has is that she's trying to help basically dismantle the department that she runs. But what would you say the benefit would be if we could dismantle the Department of Education? Maybe just make it, instead of a cabinet level department, maybe just having it be more of an advisory position to the president.
Back in the early 80s, I'm gonna answer your question. Back in the early 80s, during the kind of quote unquote conservative revolution, there were different, I'm gonna recant that. From the second half of the 20th century, the inception of William F. Buckley and the National Review, the Hoover Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, Charles Murray, Thomas Sowell, Robert Bork, Clarence Thomas. There was a group there was a think tank in the early 80s that pushed forth legislation, which we know as the voucher system today. Basically was to allocate the resources that the government expends on public schools, was to be allocated back to the parents, so therefore they can have a more decisive role in choosing their children's education, which was the purpose was to facilitate more competition. Where government monopolies, government is run by taxation. It is insulated from feedback, unlike market forces. Therefore, hence why we see all the expenditures pumped into schools, very little output. But in private and non-public schools, whether they're parochial or charter schools, you see enormous successes. The purpose of the voucher program, of course, and as well as previously mentioned, of doing away with monopolies, it gives parents the power to put their money where they see fit. And educators, there's numerous educators whose educational or whose teachings may not be permissible by government hegemony. Example, the infamous Jaime Escalante, the film Stand and Deliver, the Hispanic American calculus teacher who taught Hispanic children in East LA calculus. The results were so high, the education establishment said, "You're cheating, this is nonsense." They administered the test again, and it was the same results. Jaime Escalante, irrespective of his successes, was feared a high degree of scrutiny from the educational establishment. Not because he did a bad job, but because his methods were different from what they were prescribing.
He was getting results.
He was getting results.
You know what it reminds me of? One of my cousins in Detroit. I remember, God, it's been 20 years ago. He started working for a soft drink company, I'll just say, and he was low man on the totem pole, brand new, and it's a union shop. And I remember him telling me, he was like, he's out there and, he has this great work ethic and he's out there busting his butt. And some of the older guys told him, hey, young man, slow down. If you keep working at that pace, they're going to expect the rest of us to do that. And I never forget him telling me that. And then, of course, then years later, I ended up working in a union shop. I did not join the union because it was not a closed shop. Ended up joining working in a union shop. And one of the things I realized is that the union sought to keep the standards low. And the people who ran to the union the most were the people who actually were the worst employees. They're the ones who were late to work all the time, who were abusive to customers all the time. And I think what you're experiencing and what you're talking about is the same thing, is that when you have a teachers union and these other entities that are there, they're there for the benefit of the teachers, not there for the benefit of the students. And so I've asked this question on multiple occasions, is like, please explain to me why education should not be subject to the free market like everything else is. Why is education not subject to the free market? Why is medicine not subject to the free market? So, I mean, it's one of those questions, and we could go on and on about this, but Mario, definitely a pleasure to sit here and hang out here in DC with you, man. And I'm glad you brought me over here. Of course, I've driven past here many times and didn't realize that this was the infamous Dunbar High School. So I appreciate you taking me out. And yeah, you have any last words you want to say?
No, I just hope, one of the things I hope to achieve in this day and age where we have an abundance of access to resources, a lot of the evidence or a lot of bodies of work that I mentioned have been around for literally decades and are accessible. Dr. Sowell's infamous journal he wrote in the late 1970s, Patterns of Black Excellence. You can Google it right now and obtain it. He's mentioned, he extensively researched, he's one of the few scholars to extensively research Dunbar High School throughout the years, and it's put in his subsequent work from black rednecks, white liberals,
yes,
as well as wealth, poverty, and politics.
And of course, basic economics. He mentioned it in basic.
Yeah, it's an excerpt of Dunbar, and Dunbar's, as I previously mentioned, how did a Martin Luther King come from a Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta? How did a Thurgood Marshall come from Frederick Douglass High School in Maryland? How did a Clarence Thomas come from a St. Pius X High School under Catholic nuns? Thomas Sowell himself. In Harlem, the teachers were predominantly Orthodox Jewish or Irish Catholic, and the few black teachers were mostly of West Indian ancestry. So, the notion that racial, religious, or ethnic composition matters in facilitating, which you constantly heard for black children described, that you need black teachers for black children to get ahead, is just ridiculous and nonsense.
Cool. Well, appreciate you, and let me see if I can get this. I don't know how well you guys can see me because I'm doing it almost selfie style, but this is Christopher Harris, Executive Director of Unhyphenated America here in Northwest Washington, D.C. with my friend Mario, and I appreciate you guys listening in. I hope you gained something. I hope we asked them questions that make you want to go out and do further research. Thanks for listening in, folks. Take care. God bless.